Marcus had meant to be back at his desk. He was an intern, eager, tired, still getting the hang of coffee orders and filing, but a visitor at the reception caught his attention. A woman in a weathered coat stood with a paperback of appointment cards, her face searching in a way Marcus recognized from his sign language class. She mouthed words without sound, hands hovering. The receptionist fumbled apologetically. Marcus stepped forward and signed, "Can I help you?" The woman's face brightened like dawn. She signed back, quick and clear, and Marcus answered, his fingers tentative then sure. For a few minutes the lobby fell into a small, rescued silence of hands and careful looks. She asked about a meeting on the 20th floor. He guided her to the elevator, palms open, translating where needed. He wasn't supposed to leave the front desk, but he couldn't leave her there. Their conversation was easy, a stitched rhythm of fingers and smiles. When they reached the 20th floor he signed "Meeting," and a voice from inside said, "Come in." The office they entered smelled faintly of polish and old paper. Light fell across a broad desk and photographs lined the wall. Ribbon cuttings, award ceremonies, one portrait that anchored them all, the CEO. The woman signed quickly and with urgency. Marcus leaned in, translating. The man at the desk rose, slow and careful, and in that instant Marcus assumed he was merely a company leader. The woman took his hands and signed with steady fingers that she had been searching for him for 30 years. Marcus realized then that he was witnessing something private. He relayed the words aloud as he signed, then watched the man's face change. Lines of control melted into a look Marcus could not name. The man signed back, fingers trembling, recounting a night decades past, a rushed goodbye at a hospital, a promise made and then folded into a life that filled every space except one. "Name?" Marcus signed and spoke. "David," the man answered with a voice like gravel. The woman signed her name, Margaret. She told him she'd kept a name in her pocket, a clue, a hope. David's hands moved like someone reaching for a story he tried to forget. He touched a photograph and his mouth tightened. He signed, simple and raw, "I'm sorry." Margaret watched him and after a long stillness signed, "I forgive." Marcus translated the confession. He felt weight in his chest, the sudden knowledge that his small skill had become the bridge between people remade by years. Lawyers and HR were mentioned but stayed in the background. For now, there were hands and faces and memory, an intimate moment that refused to be anonymized by policy. When David looked at Marcus, he asked, signing slowly as if testing the air, "You know sign?" Marcus nodded and confessed he'd taken a class at community college. The admission seemed to make David lighter. "Would you stay?" David signed. "Help translate." Marcus swallowed. He had not expected to be handed a role that mattered, but he agreed. He would be there. The weeks that followed were a lesson in humility. Marcus translated rows of halting questions, the blunt ache of years and the careful attempts at repair. The son, when he arrived, had the guarded posture of someone used to answering questions with silence. He was younger than Marcus thought and angrier in ways that made sense. He wanted explanations, or maybe he wanted nothing at all. David wanted to tell a story that made amends. Margaret wanted acknowledgement. Marcus shaped their hands into words, careful to leave room for pauses where silence would do the work words could not. Marcus didn't become a fixer overnight. He practiced signs in the evening, fingers moving through air as if rehearsing choreography. He read about family mediation, how to hold space for people whose pain predated policies, and he learned to slow his voice so it matched the cadence of the hands he translated. Coworkers began dropping by his desk to ask him to teach them a simple hello or thank you. He would show them the signs and they'd laugh at their awkward fingers. Those small moments mattered because they softened the building, one gesture at a time. The son, whose name was Elijah, had a life as complicated as anyone's. He worked as a civil engineer, tight-lipped about family histories, and had a daughter who adored dinosaurs and dramatic bedtime stories. He had been raised by a woman who loved him fiercely and protected him from a truth she thought might hurt him. When Elijah learned that Margaret had been searching, it was as if a hidden current pulled him to shore and left him breathless. He pressed questions into David and came away with answers that filled in pieces without erasing the whole. David answered with a dozen explanations that sounded thin. He told stories of travel and company crises, of a younger self who made choices out of panic. But more than explanations, he brought artifacts: a faded blanket, a hospital bracelet, a letter he'd written and never mailed. They went through the items together like archaeologists of a life. The son handled each with a mixture of anger and curiosity. Marcus learned how to sign regret, fear, and attempt, so the words carried the proper tilt and weight. HR arranged counseling sessions, and the company took pains to keep the meetings private. The board agreed to no public statements. A single journalist's tip that led to nothing was ignored. The family negotiated carefully, wanting to build a relationship on trust rather than spectacle. They discovered, slowly, that some bridges needed time and ordinary repetition. A phone call, a shared dinner, an awkward holiday where everyone stumbled over who would pass the mashed potatoes first. Marcus found himself present in the small rituals. He translated an apology at a kitchen table. He signed the way a grandfather joked about the weather, and he laughed with Elijah over an embarrassing childhood photo. He learned that presence could be the most radical thing. Being there when a person needed to be seen and not trying to fix everything at once. His role shifted from translator to confidant in places where words were brittle. At work, the accessibility program grew from a single seminar into a quarterly training. The company invested in captioning services and updated its website to be more accessible. They partnered with local organizations that supported the deaf community and funded scholarships for sign language classes. The memo credited Marcus as the young intern who had sparked the initiative. It was a small line in a lengthy internal email, but Marcus framed it and hung the printout in his apartment like a totem of a moment when things changed. People noticed the change in David as well. He began to show up for town halls and sometimes used his own hands to sign a greeting to the audience, fumbling once or twice but doing it with sincerity. Employees who had once feared him found his presence more approachable. Board members whispered about the softening of a CEO who had always been brilliant at spreadsheets but less skilled at tenderness. Yet there were skeptics who wondered whether a corporate leader could truly change. Marcus didn't know the answer, but he watched small shifts. A more careful meeting, a delayed decision to make room for people. One winter evening, David invited a handful of employees to a private gathering. They sat around a long table as Margaret brought out plates of pie. Elijah's daughter fell asleep with her head on a napkin, and Marcus watched David scoop her into his arms with something like bewildered joy. He thought of the quiet moment when a man learns how to hold what he once set down. At the end of the evening, David stood and, in a voice that softened many hearts, thanked everyone for their patience while he learned to listen as much as he had led. Marcus graduated from intern to community liaison in part-time capacity, and in part because he'd become indispensable in a way no one had anticipated. He led workshops at local high schools, speaking about accessibility and the importance of small acts. He told the story of the day he walked a woman to an elevator and, without planning it, changed the course of 3 lives. He never exaggerated. He spoke about the awkwardness, the missteps, and the humility required to hold space for other people's pain. Months later, when the company opened a new wing and cut a ribbon, Margaret and Elijah stood together in the front row. David placed his hand over his heart and mouthed a benediction with a face that had been softened by forgiveness. Marcus watched from the side, satisfied in a way that was not about recognition but about having been a thread in a fabric. He kept signing, teaching, and listening, understanding that the quiet languages we learn are sometimes the ones that rebuild the loudest parts of our lives. He kept going quietly.